Hello, this is Swords, and today we're going to be talking about this, a Persian Qajar Era Straight Sword from around 1850. This straight sword is a so-called revival sword, harkening back to earlier sassanid swords, as posited by Manouchehr Khorasani in his book Arms and Armour from Iran, which I will link below, and which was the major source used for the study of this particular sword. This sword, being a revival sword, has a straight blade with downturned quillions and an all-steel hilt. It has various interesting and unique design and aesthetic elements which we'll get into a little bit later, but first something on its general history. This sword, as mentioned, is from around 1850, and it thus dates to the Qajar Era, which went from 1794 to 1925. During this time, a Turkic tribe, the Qajars, took control of Persia, and in order to amplify their perceived prominence and their perceived provenance to the region, the idea that they were the rightful rulers of the region, they adopted certain revival aspects to the way they dressed and armed themselves. However, this is a ceremonial sword and is not an actual combat armament. This included the adoption of these straight swords with these retrospective hilts. These hilts have several features which harken back to earlier times, such as the downturned quillions, which are reminiscent of Temurid swords. They have a unique three-lobed pommel, and this one actually has a false peen, which we'll look at later. The hilt is made out of two pieces which are brazed together with a brass-like substance. The brazing is very finely done, and there is only a small amount of delamination here on the pommel, probably due to transport. For the same reason, this quillion is slightly compressed. The blade, as you can see, is straight, broad, and very heavily etched. It's also extremely thin, harkening back to the fact that this is a ceremonial sword. There were variants of this type of sword which had Wootz blades, often with a diamond or fuller diamond cross-section. However, this is one of the more common monosteel blades. It has been very elaborately and extensively etched with rather good attention to detail, in a process which was developed around 1830 to 1850 in Persia. Rather late for etching of steel in this particular style, but that's when it happened in Persia. It features Quranic inscriptions along the length of the blade, as well as a serpent, going from tail to head on this side, and from head to tail on this side. I cannot read any of the inscriptions on this, so if you can, I'd really appreciate it. There will be a roll of footage later which has detailed photographs of this blade. There are several theories as to the purpose of the symbology of the dragon's heads and the serpent on the blade. In the case of the serpent over the Quranic script, it is hypothesized that this confers a protective effect to the Quranic script, which is of course sacred in the religion of Islam. The dragon's head are supposed to convey a protective fire over the blade, in conjunction with the concept that the wielder has mastered the dragons by holding the blade. Of course, this is rather useless on a blade that is not intended to see combat. However, the concept and aesthetic appeal is very evident. The blade, as mentioned, is fairly broad and very thin, and thus very flexible. It also balances rather significantly down the blade. This is a minor problem considering this was a ceremonial sword for processions or religious ceremony. It is fairly well made, being around 960 grams for a total length of 94 centimeters. And it is fairly wieldy if you were to wear it on your side, for example. However, it does not have its original scabbard. Given that this was not made for combat, and none of these Persian Revival swords really were, even the Wootz ones, it's fair to say that the aesthetic qualities are more important than the functional qualities in this particular sword, as it is not even sharpened anywhere on the blade. The Qajar rulers who had this style of blade were trying to harken back to earlier sassanid designs in order to increase the validity of their regime, as they had to overthrow the Zand rulers in order to get their position in the ruling class of Persia at the time. We see hilts like these on contemporary Qajar era artwork depicting Sassanid era kings, thus indicating the intention of this sword design. We also see them with curved blades, but these hilts on contemporary Qajar era artwork on Temurid and Sassanid rulers, thus reinforcing that idea. This is mentioned in depth in Khorasani's book, which I highly recommend you read. On a note for that book, there are only 3 or 4 of these swords within that text, versus around 50 Shamshir, indicating the relative scarcity of this, especially considering it was only made for a short period of time, somewhere between the beginning of 1800 to around 1870. This one is somewhere from the middle of that period. Swords of the straight Qajar era type are also seen in art from Europe, not just Qajari art and sculptures from Persia. One example of this is the rather famous painting Bitwa pod Grunwaldem, or the Battle of Grunwald, by Polish painter Jan Matejko. This was painted in 1878, and is thus of a similar time to the Qajar era. It is, however, depicting a battle that took place in 1410, and thus many of the items used as decorations and weapons in the painting are vastly anachronistic, in this case some 470 years off of the actual event. In the hands of Lithuanian King Witold, we see a Qajar Era Straight Sword, one of the rarer examples with multiple fullers and a diamond cross-section blade. This is of course wildly anachronistic and culturally inappropriate considering he is a Lithuanian Grand Duke and not a Persian Qajari king. This is only one of the examples of historical inaccuracies in Jan Matejko's paintings, due to the fact he had a limited selection of props in order to do his battle recreations and paintings. This is something rather commonly seen in his paintings, and is overshadowed by the artistic and compositional brilliance which I personally see in them, and many other critics do too. Regardless, it's an interesting detail that is worth noting as a non-Persian depiction of a Qajar Era Revival straight sword. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This has been iPo Swords. Until next time, stay sharp.